And welcome again to our study of the Life Divine. We're in the first chapter of the second book, Indeterminates, Cosmic Determinations in the Indeterminable. And at the beginning you'll remember that Sri Aurobindo has drawn quotations to support his perspective from the Upanishads, from the Bhagavad Gita, and we'll come to close contact with resonance from those passages as we go through this tonight. Clearly, part of what Sri Aurobindo is trying to decide through the use of philosophy is whether or not we can arrive at a view which sees that from a fundamental indeterminate, cosmic determinations can arise. How is it that a universe can come out of being when we can't say anything about that being? We can't finally fix a definition of what the supreme reality is, because it exceeds all definitions. It is ever free, even as it pours itself into the power of becoming. So how would we arrive at a stance where the mind can appreciate what that is? And Sri Aurobindo has been going through the various limitations that are native to the mind, why it is that the mind cannot know in the way that our spiritual experience can know. So let's begin with the close of the last paragraph we looked at, and it'll help set a context, and we'll go forward from there. The question remains entire, whether all this evolution and action is a phenomenal creation by some universal energy presented to the mental being, or an activity imposed by mind energy on the Purusha's indeterminate, perhaps indeterminable existence, or whether the whole is something predetermined by some dynamic truth of self within, and only manifested on the mind's surface. To know that, we would have to touch or enter into a cosmic state of being and consciousness to which the totality of things and their integral principle would be better manifest than to our limited mind experience. So, an indeterminate reality, perhaps consanguineous with the Purusha, perhaps not. A dynamic truth of the self, so a self that is not abstracted sheerly into innate being without any power to move, but always simply self-contained in self-awareness. And if it acts, something that might predetermine its action, in other words, its intent is inherent in the beginning of its action, therefore cannot get lost in its pursuance of that energy moving out. To get to that state that we can understand it, then we would have to either vault into a cosmic consciousness or a greater stage and state of being than the mind is capable of holding. The mind looks at part and part and part and tries to assemble a whole, but cannot see the whole vastness of it. And so, now tonight's work. Overmind consciousness is such a state or principle beyond individual mind, beyond even universal mind in the ignorance. It carries in itself a first direct and masterful cognition of cosmic truth. Here then we might hope to understand something of the original working of things, get some insight into the fundamental movements of cosmic nature. But let's remember that overmind is not the creative truth behind the manifestation of the universe. Sri Aurobindo has carefully, over the first several hundred pages, led us to understand that if we look at that indeterminable or unknowable, as it formulates itself as positive being, it is a being, a sat, which is fully conscious of itself, chit. This power of consciousness has latent within it power. So it is chit tapas, or chit shakti. But finally, its experience of itself, of its own being, and of the movements of its consciousness and power are an inalienable delight, bliss, ananda. So sat chit ananda. But it is a triune reality, impartite, all one. We look at it and we see sat chit ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. But really it is one thing. So how does that infinite become manifest? Well, through its power of chit shakti, it throws forth a movement of its own inner being through an agency that Sri Aurobindo calls the supermind, to take its vastness, its infinity, and to create a substantive, coherent, harmonious version of itself, which you might say is the first cosmos. It is held within its unity. The diversity arises from its unity without parting from its unity. And finally, the diversity stands forth and says, here we all are, without losing touch with the unity behind. But the supermind gives this diversity free agency and says, move forward. And there is established a range of conscious being, which Sri Aurobindo calls the overmind, which is colossal. It is something more than simply the cosmic consciousness of the universal awareness. But this overmind consciousness, fully resonant with what this truth consciousness, the supermind, wants to do above, takes this diversity and permits them each to go out on their own. So you can see this force and that force moving into expression with full liberty. But what happens is that unity falls farther and farther into the background. And so the diversity stands out, and when you have diversity without grounding in the unity, you arrive at perplexity. You arrive at that point in the conscious adventure where one begins to ignore the basis of self, and you arrive at ignorance through that ignoring. You forget what you are, and in a sense you tumble into division from unity. You tumble into insentience from a supreme consciousness. You tumble into an insufficient experience as you leave Ananda. So the cosmos begins through this over-mental agency's action, permitting the diversity to move out. So here we arrive again at Sri Aurobindo's look into the limitations of what is the overmind and why the overmind can't explain to us everything about the cosmos, because it is not the originator of the cosmos. We have to climb still farther, but a step at a time and a sentence at a time. So as he says, we might hope to understand something through this overmind consciousness about the original workings and movements of cosmic nature. One thing indeed becomes clear. It is self-evident here that both the individual and the cosmos come from a transcendent reality which takes form in them. So above there is a transcendence which is beyond the line of manifestation. It remains in itself above, and yet throws forward cosmos and individual as expressions of itself. The mind and life of the individual being, its self in nature, must therefore be a partial self-expression of the cosmic being. And both through that and directly, a self-expression of the transcendent reality. A conditional and half-veiled expression it may be, but still, that is its significance. So the individual never really exists apart from the context of the cosmos. Even if in our worst alienation as egos, we feel that I am me and everything else is that, and that is a fiction, because the ego is always placed within the larger being, the cosmic being. And the person, the real individual in us, expresses that cosmic being as both cosmos and individual express that transcendence. So we're, in a sense, a little universe moving in a larger universe, but all expressions of what is so much vaster than the universe. Big as this is, to what is transcendent, is it even a dot? But also, he says, we see that what the expression shall be is also determined by the individual himself. Only what he can in his nature receive, assimilate, formulate, his portion of the cosmic being or of the reality, can find shape in his mind and life in physical parts. Something that derives from the reality, something that is in the cosmos he expresses, but in the terms of his own self-expression, in the terms of his own nature. So we have a particular, unique formation within this cosmic reality. And what we draw from nature to form that is appropriate to what we're developed to do. There's a suggestion here buried in this sentence of an evolution that the individual develops through cosmic experience and cosmic action. To get back to his sentences here. But the original question set out for us by the phenomenon of the universe is not solved by the overmind knowledge. The question in this case, whether the building of thought, experience, world of perceptions of the mental person, the mind Purusha, is truly a self-expression, a self-determination, proceeding from some truth of his own spiritual being, a manifestation of that truth's dynamic possibilities, or whether it is not, rather, a creation or construction presented to him by nature, by Prakriti, and only in the sense of being individualized in his personal formation of that nature can it be said to be his own or dependent on him. Or again, it might be a play of a cosmic imagination, a fantasia of the infinite imposed on the blank indeterminable of his own eternal pure existence. These are the three views of creation that seem to have an equal chance of being right, and mind is incapable of definitely deciding between them. For each view is armed with its own mental logic and its appeal to intuition and experience. Overmind seems to add to the perplexity, for the overmental view of things allows each possibility to formulate itself in its own independent right and realize its own existence in cognition, in dynamic self-presentation, in substantiating experience. Overmind is a gate. Open the gate, let them go. Impersonally supporting each movement. So then, a fantasia, by the way, is a composition of imagination which is allowed to go outside the normal customary limits of something. So the three views that he's talking about here, one, self-determination is at the root of the cosmos. There is a conscious self saying, I will be thus, and throws out the universe. Or perhaps it's a Prakritic construction, that nature simply constructs this thing, acting independently of Purusha, of the conscious person, and throws it upon him. Or the third thing is that it's just this fantasia, just a lark. There's some dreaming consciousness just having a lark. And he says here in this last sentence about overminds adding to the perplexity, giving that each possibility can go out and formulate itself. Well, this was the overmind's brief to carry. This is what it was supposed to be doing. It's licensed to take this action, emerging from the supermind and giving liberty to all that is diverse. So it's not wrong to do that. That's what the supermind, in a sense, delegated to the overmind to do. In overmind, he continues, in all the higher ranges of the mind, we find recurring the dichotomy of a pure, silent self without feature or qualities or relations, self-existent, self-poised, self-sufficient, and the mighty dynamis of a determinative knowledge power, of a creative consciousness and force, which precipitates itself into the forms of the universe. So, at the level of the overmind and down. Remember, above the mind, there are various ranges of higher consciousness leading to this great bridging consciousness of the supermind. The first we meet when we leave the mind proper, the ratiocinative philosophic mind, is the higher mind, which experiences all as the self, but in terms of thought, of vision. And then there's an illumined mind, which is illuminated by higher substance of truth descending into it from above. And above the illumined mind is an intuition, a power of real truth insight, which acts like a flash of lightning and sees things singly. But the overmind consciousness, which one reaches having climbed beyond intuition, sees globally, sees the mass of things, and yet not as does the supermind. So that even if we're speaking about the mind's experience or perception of truth, all the way up to the overmind's experience, there is this dichotomy, and a dichotomy is a division into contrasting groups. So this sits here and that sits there. In the one camp is the pure silent self. In the other camp is this mighty power that's determining, I can't speak tonight, which is determining how the cosmos shall be fashioned. The first, the self, is self-existent. It isn't created, brought into being by anything. It already exists. Poised in itself, needs nothing from outside to be happy. And counterpoint to that, on the other side, is this determinative knowledge power, this creative consciousness and force, which seems to begin and propel the universe. So, self versus Shakti, or Purusha versus Prakriti. Back to Sri Aurobindo. This opposition, which is yet a collocation, as if these two were correlatives or complementaries, although apparent contradictions of each other, sublimates itself into the coexistence of an impersonal Brahman without qualities, a fundamental divine reality free from all relations or determinants, and a Brahman with infinite qualities, a fundamental divine reality who is the source and container and master of all relations and determinations, nirguna saguna. So let's back up. The opposition, he says, is not so much an opposition as a collocation, which means to be placed together. Or they're correlatives, they're related to each other, they're not opposites. Or they're complementaries, which means to complete or fill each other up. So what seems to be opposite, the silent self here, the active universe there, are deeply connected. There is no nature absent spirit. There is no spirit absent the power of nature held within it. The one is an expression of the other. But we go on, they coexist. It sublimates itself, raises itself up, so that we have an impersonal Brahman, which seems to be beyond all qualification, just a sheer ocean of conscious being, and contrasting that with a Brahman who contains infinite numbers of qualities, freely manifests them, but is not only the source and the container of them, but also master of them, implying a kind of personhood, because how can a thing be master of other things? It must be a conscious being, if it has consciousness, who extends mastery and governs, and presumably governs well. So nirguna means without quality, nir, no, and then guna, quality, and saguna means with quality. So if we pursue the nirguna into a farthest possible self-experience, we arrive at a supreme absolute, void of all relations and determinations, the ineffable first and last word of existence. If we enter through the saguna into some ultimate possible of experience, we arrive at a divine absolute, a personal, supreme, and omnipresent Godhead, transcendent as well as universal, an infinite master of all relations and determinations, who can uphold in his being 1,000,000 universes and pervade each with a single ray of his self-light and a single degree of his ineffable existence. The overmind consciousness maintains equally these two truths of the eternal, which face the mind as mutually exclusive alternatives. It admits both as supreme aspects of one reality. Somewhere then, behind them, there must be a still greater transcendence which originates them or upholds them both in its supreme eternity. But what can that be, of which such opposites are equal truths, unless it be an original, indeterminable mystery of which any knowledge, any understanding by the mind is impossible? We can know it indeed to some degree in some kind of experience or realization by its aspects, powers, constant series of fundamental negatives and positives through which we have to pursue it, independently in either, or integrally in both together. But in the last resort, it seems to escape even from the highest mentality and remain unknowable. So this is that indeterminable mystery that founds both the nirguna and the saguna. Let's go back to the beginning of the chapter and look at this section from the Gita. Taken, when men seek after the immutable, the aksharam, the indeterminable, anirudeshyam, the unmanifest, avyaktam, the all-pervading, the unthinkable, the sum itself, the immobile, the permanent, equal in mind to all, intent on the good of all beings, it is to me that they come. So there is a personhood which swallows up all of these unthinkable abstractions. They all melt into the existence of this conscious person. One sees it as a mystery, or one speaks of it or hears of it as a mystery, but none knows it. You cannot see it as an object. It is not an object outside your consciousness. You're like a fish swimming in the water, and you don't see the water around you. This is that, but that is only the manifest part of that. So the point is that we can know this in a way, but not through ratiocinative intellectual knowledge. We know it in our inner experience. We know it and then describe that experience. Put it into rational form. Make it symmetrical. Make it reflect in model-like form what it is that we've experienced. And depending on whether our experience is small or large, the model more or less fits it, but it never really captures it. It's a simulacrum. It's a representation. It's a symbol. Don't get stuck on the symbol. Keep growing, because that includes all, but also eludes all. But if the Supreme Absolute is indeed a pure indeterminable, then no creation, no manifestation, no universe is possible. And yet the universe exists. What then is it that creates this contradiction, is able to affect the impossible, bring this insoluble riddle of self-division into existence? A power of some kind it must be. And since the Absolute is the sole reality, the one origin of all things, this power must proceed from it, must have some relation with it, a connection, a dependence. For if it is quite other than the Supreme Reality, a cosmic imagination imposing its determinations on the eternal blank of the indeterminable, then the sole existence of an absolute Parabrahman is no longer admissible. This is the fantasia part. There is then a dualism at the source of things, not substantially different from the Sankhya dualism of soul and nature. If it is a power, the sole power indeed of the Absolute, we have this logical impossibility that the existence of the Supreme Being and the power of his existence are entirely opposite to each other. Two supreme contradictories. This is that division between Purusha and Prakriti. For Brahman is free from all possibility of relations and determinations, but Maya is a creative imagination imposing these very things upon it, an originator of relations and determinations of which Brahman must necessarily be the supporter and witness to the logical reason, an inadmissible formula. So separate realities. Determinations? We're essentially asking the question here, is the world real or not? So Sri Aurobindo continues, if it is accepted, it can only be as a suprarational mystery. Something neither real nor unreal, inexplicable in its nature, anirvachaniya. But the difficulties are so great that this perspective, can be accepted only if it imposes itself irresistibly as the inevitable ultimate, the end and summit of metaphysical inquiry and spiritual experience. For even if all things are illusory creations, they must have at least a subjective existence, and they can exist nowhere except in the consciousness of the sole existence. They are then subjective determinations of the indeterminable. So, even dreams are real to a real being. If it has conceived of something, in its imagination, it exists. It exists. If, on the contrary, the determinations of this power are real creations, out of what are they determined? What is their substance? It is not possible that they are made out of a nothing, a non-existence other than the Absolute, for that will erect a new dualism, a great positive zero over against the greater indeterminable X we have supposed to be the one reality. So this is an argument that cuts at the basis of both Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. It is evident, therefore, that the reality cannot be a rigid indeterminable. Whatever is created must be of it and in it, and what is of the substance of the utterly real must itself be real. A vast, baseless negation of reality, purporting to be real, cannot be the sole outcome of the eternal truth, the infinite existence. So if we can posit an infinite existence, we seem to have done that, then what it conceives in its own being impliedly is real, cannot be unreal, cannot be unsubstantial, cannot be absent all that is contained within real being, that is to say, consciousness and delight. It is perfectly understandable that the absolute is and must be indeterminable in the sense that it cannot be limited by any determination or any sum of possible determinations, but not in the sense that it is incapable of self-determination. So this unknowable is free to enter into and manifest a cosmos, to determine, that is, to put boundaries around its being, to take its infinity and compress it into finitude, to make it finite, to form something, give it shape, give it name, and make it real. And in so doing, it can do this through infinite numbers of being in the universe or infinite numbers of universes themselves, and yet never be bound by any of it, always remain free and indeterminable in its own absolute essence, even though it has become all this, even though it has become positive cosmic being, even though it has become positive transcendent being. It transcends even that transcendence, you see? The supreme existence cannot be incapable of creating true self-determinations of its being, incapable of upholding a real self-creation or manifestation in its self-existent infinite. So real being must have power to self-determine, must have power to create and inhabit forms, because everything is within it, and it is within everything. There is no outside. There is only this one indeterminable being. All, in a sense, floats within it. Overmind, then, gives us no final and positive solution. It is in a supramental cognition beyond it that we are left to seek for an answer. A supramental truth consciousness is at once the self-awareness of the infinite and eternal, and a power of self-determination inherent in that self-awareness. The first is its foundation and status, the second is its power of being, the dynamis of its self-existence. So first is the self-awareness, and then comes the self-determination. First it is. It's conscious of itself, and then it reaches itself out. It's not vice versa. There's not first the power, and then the consciousness arises from the power. No. The consciousness inheres in being, and the power is an extension of being into action. Dynamis. All that a timeless eternity of self-awareness sees in itself as truth of being, the conscious power of its being manifests in time eternity. So again, the supramental sees and acts in one flow, not like the mind, which has to conceive and then find means by which to effectuate itself. The divine consciousness, when it sees something, it does something. It comes into being, it takes the shape it wishes, because everything is one in it, not seemingly divided. So Chit and Shakti are expressive of this Satchit Ananda in the supramental. All that a timeless eternity of self-awareness sees in itself as truth of being, the conscious power of its being manifests in time eternity. Worth reading again. To supermind, therefore, the supreme is not a rigid indeterminable, an all-negating absolute, an infinite of being, complete to itself in its own immutable purity of existence. Its sole power, a pure consciousness able only to dwell on the being's changeless eternity, on the immobile delight of its sheer self-existence, is not the whole reality. That is the stance that we often consider to be the nature of the self, of the Atman. Sheer conscious existence, unmoving, immaculate, white, undisturbed in its purity. But the Supreme is not divorced from power and delight, as we'll go on to see. The infinite of being must also be an infinite of power, containing in itself an eternal repose and quiescence. It must also be capable of an eternal action and creation. But this too must be an action in itself, a creation out of its own self, eternal and infinite, since there could be nothing else out of which it could create. Any basis of creation seeming to be other than itself must be still really in itself and of itself, and could not be something foreign to its existence. So consciousness is power, and creation is self-contained within real being. An infinite power cannot be solely a force resting in a pure and active sameness, an immutable quiescence. It must have in it endless powers of its being and energy. An infinite consciousness must hold within it endless truths of its own self-awareness. These in action would appear to our cognition as aspects of its being, to our spiritual sense as powers and movements of its dynamis, to our aesthesis as instruments and formulations of its delight of existence. Creation would then be a self-manifestation. It would be an ordered deploying of the infinite possibilities of the infinite. And of course, this is the nature of the supermind. But every possibility implies a truth of being behind it, a reality in the existent. For without that supporting truth, there could not be any possibles. In manifestation, a fundamental reality of the existent would appear to our cognition as a fundamental spiritual aspect of the divine absolute. Out of it would emerge all its possible manifestations, its innate dynamisms. These again must create, or rather bring out of a non-manifest latency, their own significant forms, expressive powers, native processes. Their own being would develop their own becoming, swarupa, swabhava. This then would be the complete process of creation. But in our mind, we do not see the complete process. We see only possibilities that determine themselves into actualities. And though we infer or conjecture, we are not sure of a necessity, a predetermining truth, an imperative behind them which capacitates the possibilities, decides the actualities. But the process is from inside out. It is seen within and then executed into form. And thus, the supramental extends itself into materials and formations which are appropriate to cosmic nature. Our mind is an observer of actuals, an inventor or discoverer of possibilities, but not a seer of the occult imperatives that necessitate the movements and forms of a creation. For in the front of universal existence, there are only forces determining results by some balance of the meeting of their powers. The original determinant or determinants, if it or they exist, are veiled from us by our ignorance. But to the supramental truth consciousness, these imperatives would be apparent, would be the very stuff of its seeing and experience. In the supramental creative process, the imperatives, the nexus of possibilities, the resultant actualities, would be a single whole, an indivisible movement. The possibilities and actualities would carry in themselves the inevitability of their originating imperative, all their results, all their creation, would be the body of the truth which they manifest in predetermined, significant forms and powers of the all-existence. This really captures it. In a sense, this is Satkaryavada carried to the extreme. The truth of things is carried forward into the conclusion. And here it really is Sat. Because the truth consciousness, drawing from the infinity of Satchit Ananda, conceives and extends the energizing of its vision into the forms which by their indwelling become significant. Remember that image, or that phrase that Clive Bell used in that book, Art, significant form, to capture what it is that we love about something which is really moving and harmonious and brings deep aesthesis or aesthesis to us. So significant forms and powers of the all-existent, because everything here has latent within it the Mahashakti. The great power indwells all beings here. We see it not. We see inconscience. We see limitation. We see the weak. But everything is filled with the Supreme Presence and is innately mighty. Ultimately, what we draw from this is that we do not dwell in an accidental universe. All has been predetermined in this gigantic but harmonious vision which exists in the supermind. So all that it has foreseen rolls into the cosmos and effectuates itself. But with our divided mind, we see only the first act of a play and want to reach a conclusion about what the third act will lead us to. We experience this particular sensation right now and don't know what is in the front. We order a meal, we get the salad and declare it a disaster, but we haven't got the main course, nor have we seen the dessert. Indeed, the mind is not capable of judging that. We'll do one more paragraph. Our fundamental cognition of the Absolute, our substantial spiritual experience of it, is the intuition or the direct experience of an infinite and eternal existence, an infinite and eternal consciousness, an infinite and eternal delight of existence. In overmental and mental cognition, it is possible to make discrete and even to separate this original unity into three self-existent aspects, for we can experience a pure, causeless, eternal bliss so intense that we are that alone. Existence, consciousness, seem to be swallowed up in it. No longer ostensibly in presence. A similar experience of pure and absolute consciousness and a similar exclusive identity with it is possible. And there can be two, a like identifying experience of pure and absolute existence. But to a supermind cognition, these three are always an inseparable trinity, even though one can stand in front of the others and manifest its own spiritual determinants. For each has its primal aspects or its inherent self-formations, but all of these together are original to the triune absolute. Love, joy, and beauty are the fundamental determinants of the divine delight of existence. And we can see at once that these are of the very stuff and nature of that delight. They are not alien impositions on the being of the Absolute or creations supported by it, but outside it. They are truths of its being, native to its consciousness, powers of its force of existence. So if there is an Ananda, then love, joy, and beauty are the first determinants. They move forward and inform all else that flows out of that. So too is it with the fundamental determinants of the absolute consciousness, knowledge and will. They are truths and powers of the original consciousness force, Chit Shakti, and are inherent in its very nature, to know and to empower that vision and effectuate. This authenticity becomes still more evident when we regard the fundamental spiritual determinants of the absolute existence. They are its triune powers, necessary first postulates for all its self-creation or manifestation. Self, the divine, the conscious being. Atman, Ishvara, Purusha. So, that is a wonder. We will finish the chapter next week, should we make it so far. I presume the cosmos will continue to move along, having its inalienable experience of delight, its gathered focus, and what we shall reach together in an ultimate harmony. I think we can end with harmony from Savitri this evening. We're again continuing with that passage from Book 2, the Book of the Traveler of the Worlds, Canto 5, the Godheads of the Little Life. At first was only an etheric space. Its huge vibrations circled round and round, housing some unconceived initiative. Upheld by a supreme original breath, expansion and contraction's mystic act created touch and friction in the void. Into abstract emptiness brought clash and clasp. Parent of an expanding universe, in a matrix of disintegrating force, by spending it conserved an endless sum. On the hearth of space it kindled a viewless fire that, scattering worlds as one might scatter seeds, whirled out the luminous order of the stars. An ocean of electric energy formlessly formed its strange wave particles, constructing by their dance this solid scheme, its mightiness in the atom shut to rest. Masses were forged or feigned, and visible shapes. Light flung the photons, swift revealing spark, and showed in the minuteness of its flash, imaged this cosmos of apparent things. Thus has been made this real, impossible world, an obvious miracle or convincing show. Or so it seems to man's audacious mind, who seats his thought as the arbiter of truth, his personal vision as impersonal fact, as witnesses of an objective world, his erring sense, and his instrument's artifice. Thus must he work life's tangible riddle out in a doubtful light, by error seize on truth, and slowly part the visage and the veil. Or else, forlorn of faith in mind and sense, his knowledge a bright body of ignorance, he sees in all things strangely fashioned here the unwelcome jest of a deceiving force, a parable of Maya and her might. This vast perpetual motion caught and held in the mysterious and unchanging change of the persistent movement we call time, and ever renewing its recurrent beat, these mobile rounds that stereotype a flux, these static objects in the cosmic dance that are but energy's self-repeating whirls, prolonged by the spirit of the brooding void, awaited life and sense and waking mind. A little the dreamer changed his pose of stone. But when the inconscient's scrupulous work was done, and chance coerced by fixed immutable laws, a scene was set for nature's conscious play. Then stirred the spirit's mute, immobile sleep. The force concealed broke dumbly, slowly out. A dream of living woke in matter's heart. A will to live moved the inconscient's dust. A freak of living startled vacant time, ephemeral in a blank eternity, infinitesimal in a dead infinite. And Jai Ma